Hey, welcome back. We're ready to now continue with our media player application. We were coming from the previous video where we have our media player actually playing media. But what we're going to do is we're going to now advance this. We're going to amplify what we already did from this initial prototype. But before we do that, we're going to have to learn a little bit about design patterns. And the reason why we're going to learn a little bit about that because XAML, which is what we're going to be using, and C Sharp and the UI that we'll be working in Visual Studio is broken up in a particular design pattern. So I want to give you an overview of what a design pattern is, or maybe an analogy of what design patterns are. There are some books I can recommend, and a particular book I can recommend, but I'm not trying to get you to study design patterns in every design patterns because there's a lot of them. There's some main ones, and there's other ones other people have figured out. But the major ones you want to focus on to sort of get a clear understanding of how Visual Studio is using design patterns to set up our environment. Think of a design pattern like a blueprint. Think of them like blueprints or like templates for solving common problems in software design. They provide a tested, reusable solution to issues that developers frequently encountered. So this is time tested. It's been around for a very long time, right? And so they've already figured out how not to run into issues for similar things that you'd want to create. Well, to really understand design patterns, let's try to imagine building a house. Imagine this with me. You want to build this house, right? So instead of starting from scratch and inventing new methods of laying down foundations, constructing walls, and designing roofs, architects use proven strategies that have worked for many years, well into the past. These strategies ensure that the house is stable, durable, and meets, let's say, the resident's needs. If the resident is the one who's actually, designing the house and they have some specifications, let's say. These strategies ensure that the house is stable, durable, and meets all those needs, as I said before, but it also does the same thing in software development. And instead of the resident, you're talking about maybe the client or just the developer themselves. So design patterns offer similar guidance to helping developers create, let's say, like enterprise applications, to games, to database structures, so on and so forth. And it maintains scalability. That means it can grow. The application can grow and grow and grow, and you won't have any issues with it. An analogy to illustrate design patterns would be like having a recipe book for a novice chef, let's say. Each pattern will provide step-by-step guides to achieve the outcome that you want. So if you wanted to bake a cake, then you would go ahead and follow that recipe. And then you would adjust it to the taste of your client or your customers if you have customers. So in that same vein, design patterns can be modified to fit the unique requirements of each software project. Why do we do this? Well, we do it because it saves time, and saving time means saving money. It reduces errors. It makes development process more predictable and manageable. So I'll quickly remind you why we're talking about this, and we're talking about this because Visual Studio uses what's called an MVVM pattern, and it uses that with XAML on one end, C# on the other end, right? So you have XAML, which is this area down here. You can see it says XAML. That's how that's pronounced. And then on the back end, we have our C# code, which we'll be programming in. The reason why we're using the model view model pattern is because it's very powerful. It's a very powerful pattern, and it's specifically suited for applications built with XAML and C#, like these Windows presentation foundations, like this. This is called WPF application, what we're using right now. And it's also very good for the Universal Windows Platform applications, Xamarin Form applications, things of that nature. It does a very important thing, and that's called separation of concerns, meaning we don't have our code for logic and for the UI smashed into one code. What we have here is we have the back end here, which is the C# code. Then over here we separate the code or the markup for the UI, right? And it separates everything. So if we go back to that analogy with the recipe, it's almost like we separate certain spices, we separate the meats, we separate depending on the you know the recipe we're about to make. We separate all of those things in their respective areas before we end up cooking, and they all have their own special thing and responsibility. They all have their own sort of tool set required to work with them and their own responsibility that they have to achieve to be able to make the entire project work. So the first thing is the model. Let me go here. I had a shape. So we have the model here. This is like the recipe and the ingredients, if we want to keep with the same analogy. The model is exactly like the recipe and the ingredients. So it represents the data and the business logic of your application. Like how in relation to the recipe, ingredients and the recipe itself is the foundation to preparing the dish. In that same vein, the model is fundamental to your application, holding the data and the rules. So that's the model. Now let's think about next would be the view. In relation to our analogy with the recipe, let's think of that as the presentation of your dish. You're going to present your dish. You're going to focus on the layout and the design of the plate itself. Everything that's visible to the person about to eat this meal. Now, in relation to the app or whatever application you're developing, the view is the user interface. And in our case, our user interface will be designed with XAML. In other words, it's what the user sees and interacts with, like buttons, text input, visual elements, all that stuff. And then there's the view model. Let me make another one of these. So that's the view model. The view model is like, okay, so the view model in our analogy, we're trying to stick with the same analogy as the recipe. So the view model acts like a chef. So the chef interprets the recipe, which is the model, and prepares the dish and updates the view. So the view model is the bridge between the model and the view. So if I were to restructure this pattern you see here, I mean the visuals, I would do something like this and make the view model the bridge between these two. The view model handles the logic of presenting the data to the user. And it does that by taking data from the model. It'll take that data and it'll filter it or perhaps modify it. It might do something with it. And then it hands it off to the display. In essence, it makes it available for the view. So going the other way, it also handles the user's input from the view and possibly alters that input before it gets to the model. So let's say if I was going to put an address and I didn't put the right format, the view model would structure that or maybe give me an error or structure it in a way to where I can go ahead and give it to the model for processing. Now, when you're dealing with XAML, using this model view model pattern allows you to model view model pattern. Sorry. It allows you to, it makes it easier to scale up your application. It allows you to change the UI without altering the underlying logic. You can separate the logic and the UI and have those things worked on separately. You know, if you're coming from the UI to the model or you're going from the model to the UI, it doesn't matter. They're all separate, so you can work on them separately. And if I were to put that in terms of the analogy that we were using with the recipe, is no different than altering the presentation of your dish without altering the recipe itself. We do this because it makes our application more flexible, and it also enhances the ability to test your application. And more importantly, it makes your application more readable. You're going to have to work with people or things in the future, so it's always good to understand what design patterns are and how you can use them and when to use them, because it's not always important to use design patterns, but in our case we need to understand it because we are using a design pattern here in Visual Studio. So before we move on, there's one little thing you need to understand about this design pattern. This is more of a modern design pattern, but there are some basic design patterns out there, and they're broken up into 3 different, I would say, categories. There is the creational patterns, and those patterns are about instantiation, or let's say object creation. Those can be further divided as well, but let's just say that's the creational pattern. Then there's the structural pattern. Those are patterns that deal with, let's say, object composition, a structure of a class or something like that, let's say. Okay, and then there's the behavior patterns. Those patterns are about classes, objects, communication. They help define how an object interacts in a way or increases flexibility and carries out communication. That's what that does. So we can break break them down into those 3 categories for some of the basic design patterns, some of the standard design patterns out there. And under the creation patterns, you can find all kinds of design patterns. And I'm just going to name a few here. Let's talk about the singleton pattern. There's the factory method, there's the abstract factory, there's the builder, there's the prototype. The truth is, you just go ahead and look up design patterns. You'll get more on this, but this video is not really going deep into design patterns. I just want to give you an overview. So you look up, one of the most well-known is the singleton pattern, and all those ones that I just mentioned, the builder pattern. There's behavior like the observer pattern, strategy pattern, command pattern, state pattern, so on and so forth. Don't get bogged down into it, and don't think that you have to always use these design patterns. They're used like a tool, remember, like a recipe, right? If I'm going to be making filet mignon, if I'm going to be making steaks and Béarnaise sauce, I'm not going to go and open up the recipe for a cake, right? I'm not looking for anything sweet. So understand what design patterns are. There are tools in your toolbox that you're able to use when you're going to develop something and you want to know how to start that structure. And always remember that analogy or that example we gave early on about the house and it being a blueprint, right? So not starting from scratch, learning how to put up walls or make doors. We already know how to do that. Someone has already figured that out. So we just follow those techniques. Now, although we just went through that whole thing with design patterns, and Visual Studio is set up in the model view model pattern in a lot of ways, but it's not quite 100% in that pattern. We're not going to be adding to that. We're not going to be adding more files or anything like that. We're just going to be using it on the most simple scale, almost like a model view pattern. So we're going to have here our code as normal, and we're going to have our XAML here. But we want to keep things separate in such a way in our mind, so that way when we're going back and forth, we are focused either on the interface or we're focusing on the code for that interface. So that's why when we first start right now, we're going to start with buttons. We're going to start with our interface here, and then we're going to start with the logic. On the other hand, we could go back here and start the logic first and say, okay, I want to make the functions in which that button is going to use. We could do that as well. But in this video, we're going to go the opposite way. We're going to go here, and we're going to go ahead and make our buttons using XAML or using here our toolbox, which will then write XAML anyway. So how do we enhance what we have right now? Okay, I'm going to drag this down. I'm going to hold down, first I'm going to click inside of here, and I'm going to hold down the control button, and I'm going to use the middle mouse button to zoom in just a little bit like that. Now, I want to add some buttons here, so I'm going to make this window a little bit bigger so I can add some buttons. So I got to be careful where I'm clicking here. You notice it added this column here, so I'm going to Control Z that and undo that. I want to click on the window itself, so I can go down here. I'm not going to click on the grid. I'm going to click on this window right here, and then I'm going to drag this little button, this handle down just a little bit. And again, you can make yours huge or not make it huge. It's up to you. And actually, I'm going to do it like this. I want it on the side here. So this is where I'm going to put my button. Now what I can do is go ahead and get my buttons. So I'm going to go over here and grab a button. Make sure your toolbox doesn't have anything in the filter here, like any words there, because then it'll look like there's nothing there. So make sure it's just set to where it's empty in that search. Once it's empty in that search, you can go ahead and search for buttons, but normally the buttons are going to be in the common WPF control areas. There's all the controls, but we want to go under the common WPF controls, and we can see a button here, and I'm just going to drag that button right over here. And then I'm going to resize it using these control handles. Something like that. Now I'm going to name this button, and I'm first going to click on that button, go over here to my properties, and I'm going to name that button BTN, and I think this can be the start. So BTN, capital S, start. All right, and now I want to change, that's the coding name I'm going to use. Now I'm going to change the label here from button. I'm going to change that to play. And the next thing I'm going to do with this button here, I'm going to go up to the brushes, and I'm going to change that background color to something more appealing. And I like this color here, so I'm going to click on this little eyedropper, click that once, and I'm going to drag it over here and see if I like any of these colors. Something like that is good. And then the foreground, which is the text, I can change that to something else. Now I can also change the text. So here I have the text. I can go in here and hit this little arrow right here, and I can change the actual font itself. And I can change the size of the font. There we go. So I have this play button here. Now I want to go ahead and create a stop button. So just like I did before, I can go over here and drag the button over. But what I can also do, because I can see my XAML down here, I can highlight this down here in my XAML, and I can copy and paste that to the next line. Or I can come up here, select it, hit copy, Control C, and paste Control V. Now you notice I have two, one over here and one over here. And it automatically changed the name of that because you can't have two buttons with the exact same name. So you wonder, where is it? Well, they're in the exact same position. So what I'm going to have to do is drag one of these down. And then I want to change this name. So I'm going to go over here and change this name. And this will be BTN stop. And then I'm going to change the label to stop. So I can change the label actually here in my XAML. You see down here, you keep on going, and what you'll see is right here, the content. I'm going to change that to stop. So you notice we can change it here, and we can change it in the properties, or we can literally change it right here in the UI. All of these are separate, but they all work together. Now the next one we want to do is pause. Okay, so I'm going to do this again. I'm going to hit, click on this button, hit Control C to copy, and Control V to paste. I'm going to drag it down, make some space. While it's selected, here's another way we can change the text. We already know we can go down here and change it, and we can go over here and change it. What I'm going to do is I'm going to slow click in here, double click in there. And now what I can do is just change it once it highlights. There we go. And remember, that's a slow double click. Do not hit enter like I just did, because it makes a line, a new line. I'm going to just hit the escape key. Now I have this, and I need to rename this to pause. So with it selected, I'm coming over here, and I'm going to say BTN pause. Now we have three buttons. Play, check in here. Stop, check in here. Pause, check in here. Now we did this for a reason. We're doing it from the interface, the user interface, for a reason, because it makes it easier for us to go ahead and write some of the code on the back end. Why do I say that? Because once you already name these, there's another function inside of Visual Studio that allows me to double click on this button, not slow double click, but a fast double click on this button, and it'll automatically write the function using this button's name on the back end, so I don't have to write it myself. So in essence, I was being a little bit lazy, I know, but this is a more efficient way to do this. So if you remember from the previous video, we do have this hooked up to a media file. And right now it's hard-coded in there. We don't want it hard-coded. We want it when we play or when we choose one. That's okay for now. We can change that later. But I just want to make a point here, is that we have to remember that when we run our application, when I hit start to run this, and I'd like to do this whenever I make any changes to my application to make sure that everything's right. Okay, so everything seems about right. So what I want to do is reiterate something that I did in the previous video. The fact that this right here, this source, is not in the project here. This source is outside the project. And you can tell by how we are accessing the source here with the 2 dots and a slash, 2 dots and a slash. And what does that mean? That means wherever this application is starting, I want you to go back these folders to find the media file, the music file, the media folder, the music folder, and then the Electron City file. So let me show you how that looks again. If you don't remember from the previous video, I'm going to go to where this is located. Okay, here is where my application is located. However, when I run it, it's going to be in the debug. This is the application here. So I would have to go back 1, 2, and then 3. So I had to go back 3 times, 3 levels to get to this media folder. As you can see down here, the media folder, then there should be a music folder inside of there. And there's the music folder, and inside the music folder there should be an Electron City, and there it is right there. So that's how we're accessing everything, and you'd always want to remember that, because when we hit that button, we'll know we need to know where our media is that we're trying to play. Now, if we're going to prevent this from playing automatically, because we had it coded in there, and we're going to get rid of that, right now when I run it again, you'll listen if you can hear it. It starts playing. We don't want that. We're going to stop that. So I need to go here to this media element right here. And I'm going to access a property here called loaded behavior. And I can also go here and type loaded behavior inside of here. Go here. And I can put it to manual. Now we have our loaded behavior as manual. Now what should happen when I run it, let me run this, it should not start. The music shouldn't start. Yeah, there we go. Good, perfect. So we're not going to be doing a lot of code here. Remember, we're taking little steps to improve on this, and after we're done with this one, we're going to improve on our media player even further, but we do want to understand that we're breaking things down into small elements. So we want to now, since we have it stop playing, we now want to make it play when we hit the play button. Now, I can code this play button. I can code an event by going over here to this lightning bolt, and I can go to the click event or the on mouse down or the click event. So right now I have the media player selected. I want to go to this button, and on the button there's this click event right here. I can double click inside of this empty spot and it will write code on the back end like I said before, or I can double click on this button and it'll do the same. So I'm going to do it from here first. I'm going to double click on that button. You notice what it did. It created this function. It gave it the name of the button with the underscore click event name. And it created this function for us. This function begins here and ends here, and here's where we're going to put our code. Now I want to access my media player. So the media player itself is an element inside the UI. It's inside the XAML, right? But it's also a class. And so we can access the properties of this simply by calling its name on the back end. And right now, this is called media element 1, as we can see here under the name. And I can go back here. I'm going to hit Control S to save that. I can go back here and put media element 1. What do I want to do with media element 1? I want it to play. And remember, we already have the name of the file we wanted to play for now. And now we have our button activating the play action. So before I move on, I want to go ahead and test this. I'm going to hit Control S to save. I'm going to play. Bring this over. Let me hit the play button. There we go. Good. Stop doesn't work. Pause doesn't work because we haven't done that, but it's fairly simple. We go back here, and we're going to make another one of these functions for the pause and for the stop. So go back here, and remember, we can do it through the events. I'm going to select this button, and instead of doing it through the events, not the properties, but the events, hitting that click, we can double click there, or I can go here and I'm going to double click this, and it automatically made this for me. And again, I want this media player object, which is in the UI, and I'm going to go ahead and say stop, since this is the stop function that I'm working with. And finally, I'm going to do the same thing with the pause, and you try it yourself for the pause. So I'm just going to go back over here, and I'm going to select this button. I'm going to go back to my properties here, and I'm going to go to this event. I'm going to double click on that empty click spot, and then it's going to create this for me. And then I'm going to call up the name that I have on the front end on the UI, and then I'm going to use the pause function here. Hit Control S to save. So now when I run my application, remember, this is not as complicated as our application is going to get, but it's a little bit more complicated than it was before. Understand that that's the mindset, this slow growth to building on something and making it more and more complex without doing things that's too complex. And over time, it does become complex but understandable because you're breaking it down into small steps as we develop our application. I just want to make sure everything is saved by hitting Control S, and then I'm going to play. And now it's not going to start because we made it manual. I'm going to hit play. It starts. It should start. There we go. I'm going to hit pause. And I'm going to hit play again. There we go. And I can hit stop. Perfect. You know, the only thing we might need here is an exit button to close our application. But most people know to hit the X. And you can maybe put that part of your documentation, add some other stuff. And this is where we're going to stop here, because we've learned about design patterns. We've learned how to use the XAML. And later what we're going to do is we're going to add on to this to make this even more dynamic. We may even make it to where we can change the sound and the frequency of the music, whatever the case might be. But we're going to go further into object-oriented programming and object-oriented concepts in the next one. And we're going to learn how to make this more advanced, but also learning more advanced topics in programming. So hopefully this video was helpful to you. If you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below, and I'll see you guys next time.